In previous videos, we talked about the early generations. This video will focus on the last two generations of the hero era, centered around the Trojan War and the events that followed. The Trojan War began due to a prophecy by Prometheus, or depending on the version, the goddess of justice, Themis. The prophecy said that if Zeus had a child with the goddess Thetis, that child would overthrow him. So Zeus, terrified, arranged for Thetis to marry the hero Peleus. Peleus was the king of Phthia in Thessaly, had participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, and was the brother of Telamon, an Argonaut. The wedding between Peleus and Thetis was a grand affair with almost all the gods invited, except for the goddess of discord, Eris. However, Eris still showed up, though she wasn't allowed in. In retaliation, she wrote on a golden apple, "For the fairest," and threw it among the gods. After a bit of fighting, only three goddesses remained: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. The male gods couldn't settle the dispute, so they asked Prince Paris of Troy to decide. Athena promised Paris glorious victories in battle. Hera promised to make him the ruler of all men, and Aphrodite promised that he would win the love of Helen, the queen of Sparta. Without wasting time, Paris gave the apple to Aphrodite, as Helen was famous for her beauty, which surpassed all other Greek women. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and the nymph Leda. To avoid Hera's jealousy, Zeus turned into a swan to mate with Leda. Leda then laid an egg, from which Helen and the hero Polydeuces were born. Leda's official husband, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, also had a son, Castor, and a daughter, Clytemnestra, making Helen's family have two sons and two daughters. Even as a young woman, Helen's beauty was renowned, leading to her kidnapping by Theseus, though her two brothers rescued her during Theseus's misadventures in the underworld, which I already covered in the story of Theseus. After that, Tyndareus decided to find a husband for Helen to protect her. Countless Greek men came to ask for her hand, but she chose Menelaus. Tyndareus made the others swear to protect Helen's happiness, and he also married his daughter Clytemnestra to Menelaus's brother Agamemnon. After marrying Helen, Menelaus lived with his father-in-law, and when Tyndareus died, Menelaus succeeded him as king. Returning to Paris, after giving the apple to Aphrodite, he was gifted with a magical belt that could make anyone fall in love with him. So, when Paris visited Sparta, he seduced Helen. While Menelaus was away, Helen packed up her things and left with Paris. When Menelaus found out, he immediately went to his brother Agamemnon to discuss revenge. The two brothers called upon the Greek heroes who had once courted Helen for help. One by one, the heroes arrived at the port of Aulis with their armies and ships. Notable names include the two Ajaxes, one the son of the hero Telamon, called Ajax the Great, and the other the son of King Oileus of Locris, called Ajax the Lesser, Diomedes, the king of Argos, whose strength rivaled that of the gods, and Agamemnon, who was chosen to lead the Greek coalition. However, some of the former suitors didn't want to join, like Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. After his failed attempt to win Helen's hand, he returned home, married, and had a son, so he wasn't keen on going off to fetch another man's wife. When Palamedes came to Ithaca with the summons, Odysseus pretended to be mad. He yoked a bull and a horse together and plowed the field all day, sowing salt instead of seeds. Palamedes came to see how Odysseus was mad and placed Odysseus's son, Telemachus, in the path of the plow. At first, Odysseus pretended not to notice, but when he nearly ran over his son, he snapped out of his act and had no excuse left but to join the army at Aulis. But that still wasn't enough. The prophet Calchas declared that the Greeks could only conquer Troy if the hero Achilles participated. Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, was not immortal, despite being part divine. When he was born, Thetis dipped him into the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she held him by the heel, leaving it his only weak spot. If struck there, he would die. Achilles was raised by the centaur Chiron, and as he grew, he became a perfect warrior. As for the timeline of Achilles' birth and growth, well, let's just say he's like the Greek version of Saint Jeong, sprouting up full-grown at just the right time. Upon hearing a prophecy that Achilles would die if he fought in Troy, Thetis hid him on the island of Scyros, disguised as a woman, living with the daughters of King Lycomedes. But somehow, the prophet Calchas still knew where he was. Agamemnon sent Odysseus to find Achilles. Disguised as a merchant, Odysseus brought valuable jewels to Scyros. The daughters of Lycomedes rushed to see the goods, but only one girl ignored the jewelry. She was more interested in the weapons. Odysseus then invited this daughter to come to Greece, preparing for the journey. A massive Greek army of 100,000 soldiers and over 1,000 ships gathered at the port of Aulis. However, the departure didn't go smoothly. They tried to set sail but ended up returning to Aulis every time. Then a storm hit with heavy rain and strong winds. That's when the prophet Calchas stepped in. He declared that Agamemnon had offended Artemis and must offer his virgin daughter, Iphigenia, to the goddess. The reasons for Agamemnon's offense vary in different versions, but in general, Artemis demanded restitution. Iphigenia, upon hearing this, volunteered to sacrifice herself for the greater good of Greece. However, when Calchas was about to sacrifice Iphigenia, a miraculous event occurred. A stag appeared on the altar, and Artemis magically swapped Iphigenia with the stag. The Greeks immediately understood that Artemis had accepted their prayers and began preparing to sail. Iphigenia, however, was taken to Taurica, modern-day Crimea, where she became a priestess of Artemis. As the Greek army set sail, they reached the island of Lemnos. Near it was the island of Chrysa, which had a sacred temple of the nymph Chryseis. When Hercules fought at Troy and when the Argonauts went after the Golden Fleece, they both visited the temple. Philoctetes, Hercules' disciple and heir to his bow and arrows, was sent to find the temple. The island was overgrown with wild plants, and Philoctetes had to clear the path for his companions. Eventually, they found the temple, but when Philoctetes shouted in joy, it wasn't happiness. It was because he had been bitten by a snake. He collapsed, and his companions, who weren't skilled in healing, could only watch helplessly. They took him back to the ship, but his wound began to smell awful, and he cried out in pain day and night. Eventually, Odysseus suggested they leave him behind, and everyone agreed. So, while Philoctetes was sleeping, they abandoned him on the shores of Lemnos. When he woke up, he found himself alone on the beach with only Hercules' bow, some arrows, and a bit of food. He cursed the Greeks for half the day, but then remembered that he still had Hercules' bow. Convinced that Hercules wouldn't leave him behind, Philoctetes decided to live alone like a true ancient Robinson Crusoe. The Greek army finally landed on the plains of Troy. The Trojan forces, led by Prince Hector, were already geared up and waiting. The two sides clashed for 9 long years with no clear victor. The Trojans took refuge behind their strong walls, while the Greeks built their own fortifications, dug trenches, and set up all sorts of defenses. At first, the Greeks sent Menelaus and Odysseus to negotiate, demanding the return of Helen and the wealth that Paris had stolen. But the Trojans, especially the sons of King Priam, weren't having it. The talks ended in failure. Throughout the 9 years of war, there were countless stories, but one that stands out is how Odysseus took revenge on Palamedes. As mentioned before, Palamedes had exposed Odysseus's act of pretending to be mad to avoid joining the war, forcing him to enlist. During the war, Palamedes made several valuable contributions and earned great respect, which inadvertently overshadowed Odysseus's influence. This led Odysseus to hatch a rather petty plot for revenge. One day, Palamedes called for an end to the war so that the Greek soldiers could return to their families. Odysseus seized the opportunity, hiding a sack of gold in Palamedes' tent. Then he forged a letter pretending to be from King Priam, offering the sack of gold as a reward for Palamedes' efforts and calling for a truce. He had a Trojan prisoner deliver it back to Priam, but as soon as the messenger left the camp, he was captured by the Greeks. The letter was handed over to Agamemnon, who immediately accused Palamedes of treason. Odysseus pretended to defend Palamedes, suggesting that Agamemnon search Palamedes' tent. If the sack of gold wasn't found, Palamedes would be innocent. Naturally, the gold was found, and there was no denying the evidence. Palamedes was condemned to death. He was tied up, taken to a high mountain, and stoned to death. Thus, the Greeks lost a brilliant and noble hero. All of Palamedes' previous achievements were wiped out by the false charge of betrayal. But when it came to feats of glory, no one in the Greek army could outshine Achilles. In one battle, the Greeks captured a number of prisoners, and Achilles was rewarded with the beautiful maiden Briseis. Agamemnon also received a prize, another maiden, Chryseis. Chryseis was the daughter of the old priest Chryses, who was a favorite of the god Apollo. When Chryses heard that his daughter had been taken, he brought a ransom to Agamemnon's tent, hoping to get her back. But Agamemnon not only refused to return her, he insulted the old man and threatened to kill him. As a result, in the 10th year of the war, the Greeks faced a terrible disaster. Apollo, moved by sympathy for Chryses, took his bow and hid from a distance, shooting arrows at the Greeks. People and animals alike fell dead, struck by his deadly arrows. Worse yet, a plague broke out among the Greek camp, and the death toll soared. At this point, something had to be done, so the Greek leaders called a meeting to figure out a solution. The prophet Calchas stepped forward and declared that it was Agamemnon's fault. The solution, he said, was for Agamemnon to return Chryseis and make restitution to her father. Agamemnon, who was not only wealthy but also greedy, refused to accept the blame. While he reluctantly agreed to return Chryseis, he declared that to make up for it, he would take Briseis, Achilles' prize, as his own. This move set off an explosive conflict between the Greek commander and their most powerful warrior. Achilles lashed out, calling Agamemnon a dog and a disgrace. He vowed to fight no more and stormed off to tell his mother, Thetis, the sea goddess. Upon hearing of her son's distress, Thetis went to Mount Olympus to beg Zeus to help the Trojans in order to get back at the Greeks. With Achilles absent, the battle raged on, with both sides lining up, glaring at each other. Paris led the Trojan forces, strutting around and showing off his skills. Seeing this, Menelaus immediately stepped forward. But when Paris, the man who had caused all this drama, saw the fury in Menelaus's eyes, he was so terrified he ran away. Hector, witnessing his brother's cowardice, immediately let loose a string of insults at him. Paris tried to defend himself, claiming he was just looking for a one-on-one duel, not a full-on battle. Hector, frustrated, suggested a deal. Menelaus could fight Paris in single combat, and the winner would get Helen, ending the war without further bloodshed. Menelaus, eager to settle things once and for all, agreed. The two sides quickly set up a ring for the duel. The trumpet sounded, and Paris charged with his spear, but Menelaus blocked it with his shield. Menelaus then counterattacked, throwing his spear, which pierced through Paris's shield and struck his armor. Before Paris could recover, Menelaus rushed in with his sword, raining down blows. But Hera and Athena had other plans. They didn't want a simple duel. They wanted Troy to fall. Hera sent Athena, disguised as a Trojan soldier, to stir things up. As Menelaus and Paris fought, a Trojan archer took aim and shot Menelaus in the stomach, breaking the truce. The two sides immediately resumed fighting. On the Greek side, Diomedes stood out as a hero. He charged into battle like a storm, and the Trojans were like a weak dam, overwhelmed by the force. Aeneas, the son of Aphrodite and a Trojan commander, tried to stop him but was struck by a huge rock thrown by Diomedes. Seeing her son injured, Aphrodite rushed to his side and flew off with him. Diomedes, knowing Aphrodite wasn't much of a fighter, threw his spear after them. The spear struck Aphrodite's hand, forcing her to drop Aeneas. Ares saw what happened and rushed in to help, giving Aphrodite a chariot to fly back to Olympus. Meanwhile, Hera and Athena weren't about to be outdone. They jumped into their own chariot and descended to rally the Greeks. Ares, now done cheering, jumped into the fray himself. Athena whispered to Diomedes, asking if he was afraid of Ares. Hearing this, Diomedes immediately charged at Ares. When Ares threw his spear, it missed, thanks to Athena redirecting it. Diomedes, with Athena's help, threw his spear and it hit Ares in the lower abdomen. Ares screamed in agony and fled back to Olympus. I've covered Ares' tale in another story. Meanwhile, the battle continued, and with Ares out of the picture, the Trojans were forced to retreat back within their city walls. But now it was time for Zeus to fulfill his promise to Thetis. Zeus ordered the gods to stay out of the fight and simply watch. As the armies were gearing up for another round, ready to charge at each other like a street brawl, Zeus sent out a series of twisting lightning bolts, signaling bad omens for the Greeks. The Greeks lost their spirit upon seeing this, and even Diomedes was wounded by Hector. The Trojans took full advantage, pushing the Greeks back into their camp. At this point, Agamemnon realized his mistake and sent envoys with Briseis and a pile of treasure to ask Achilles to return to the fight. But Achilles was having none of it. He called Agamemnon a dog, a disgrace, and sent the messengers away. The next day, Hector led the Trojans right up to the Greek camp again. The battle was fierce, and Agamemnon was hit by a spear, forcing him to withdraw from the battlefield. With their leader down, the Greeks were like headless chickens, and the Trojans flooded the camp, burning and destroying Greek ships. Achilles didn't need anyone to tell him. He could see that the Greeks were losing. He still held a grudge and refused to join in, but his close friend Patroclus couldn't stand by. Patroclus borrowed Achilles' armor and weapons, intending to scare the Trojans off. Achilles agreed, even sending some troops to back him up. The sight of Achilles' troops was enough to scare the Trojans into retreating like chickens. Patroclus, equipped with the best gear, fought fiercely and pushed the Trojans back from the Greek camp. But when he ran into Hector, he was killed in a single blow. Hector then looted Patroclus' armor, the armor that had belonged to Achilles. Luckily, Ajax the Great came in and fought off the Trojans long enough to retrieve Patroclus' body. When Achilles heard the news, he was devastated, crying out in rage and swearing to take revenge no matter what fate awaited him. Thetis, unable to console her son, went to Hephaestus to order a new set of armor for him. With Patroclus' body laid out before him, Achilles reconciled with Agamemnon, marking his return to the battlefield, more unstable than ever. As for the gods, Zeus had fulfilled his promise and lifted the ban on divine intervention. The teams remained the same: Hera, Athena, and Poseidon on the Greek side, and Ares, Apollo, and Aphrodite on the Trojan side. Zeus sat back to watch. Achilles rejoined the battle with one goal: to find Hector. He slashed his way through anyone who stood in his path, and the Trojans were falling like grass. But then Apollo, disguised as the Trojan warrior Agenor, stood in front of the city gates. When Achilles charged, Agenor ran, with Achilles hot on his heels. Thanks to this chase, the Trojans had time to retreat into the city. After a while, Agenor transformed back into Apollo and taunted Achilles, asking if he was crazy for chasing after a god. Achilles realized he had been tricked, frustrated but unable to do anything about it, and turned back toward Troy. But there was one Trojan who didn't retreat, Hector. Hector had thought it over and realized that Achilles wouldn't back down, so the only option was to fight. As Hector pondered, Achilles came charging at him. Hector, terrified, ran, with Achilles in pursuit. Around and around they went, circling Troy's walls. On the fourth lap, Hector was exhausted and stopped, telling Achilles that they had been running long enough and should just fight. Achilles then struck and killed Hector. He then dragged Hector's body behind his chariot, parading it in front of Troy's gates to taunt them, before heading back to the Greek camp, where he ran circles around Patroclus' body. Later, King Priam came to Achilles, begging for Hector's body so he could give him a proper burial. The old king fell to his knees, taking Achilles' hands and kissing them, even though Achilles had killed his son. Moved by Priam's grief, Achilles returned Hector's body to him and agreed to a truce for 10 days so that both sides could mourn their dead. During this time, the Greeks held a funeral for Patroclus as well. After Hector's death, Troy was left with almost no commanders, and its only option was to retreat behind its walls. Just when things seemed hopeless, a group of Amazonian warriors, led by Queen Penthesilea, arrived to aid the Trojans. Some say that Penthesilea had accidentally killed her own sister, Queen Hippolyta, and came to Troy hoping that Artemis would forgive her for the crime. Others suggest that it was because King Priam had baptized Penthesilea and she came to repay his kindness. At first, the Amazons were able to push the Greeks back, but that was because Achilles and Ajax the Great were both still in mourning. Grieving by Patroclus' grave, when they heard that the situation had changed, the two heroes quickly geared up and rushed to the battlefield. Penthesilea and Achilles met in a fierce duel. Her beauty had such an effect on Achilles that he couldn't focus properly. But after a tough fight, he eventually killed the Amazon queen. However, once she was dead, Achilles started to feel remorse, weeping over the fate of such a beautiful woman. Zeus, watching the scene, was moved and sent Hephaestus to create a sculpture of the final moments of Penthesilea's life. Achilles continued his rampage, seemingly unstoppable, but even without a foe, the gods were still very much involved. Apollo appeared and ordered Achilles to stop. Achilles, not listening and still enraged, lashed out at Apollo. This angered the god even more. As Paris unleashed arrows at the Greek forces, Apollo guided one of them, striking Achilles in his vulnerable heel. Achilles realized then that his time had come. With his last strength, he cursed the Trojans and fell dead. Both sides immediately fought fiercely over his body. Eventually, Ajax the Great and Odysseus managed to retrieve Achilles' body and bring it back to the Greek camp. This was a massive blow to the Greek forces. They held a grand funeral for Achilles and buried him beside his beloved friend Patroclus. There is also another version of Achilles' death involving the Trojan princess Polyxena, but I've already covered that in a previous video, so I won't go into it here. Since Achilles died suddenly without leaving a will, Thetis decided to pass on his armor and weapons to the warrior who protected Achilles' body. The two candidates were Ajax the Great and Odysseus, but there could only be one winner, so they decided to settle it with a vote for fairness. However, Athena had a soft spot for Odysseus and persuaded Agamemnon and Menelaus to rig the vote in his favor. Ajax was furious when he found out. One night he grabbed his sword, planning to kill Agamemnon and Menelaus, but Athena had already planned for this. She cast a spell that caused Ajax to lose his mind, leading him to wander into the cattle fields. Mistaking the livestock for enemies, he went on a killing spree, slaughtering cows, bulls, and chickens, then dragging the bodies back to his tent, convinced he had dealt with Agamemnon and Menelaus. Athena then informed Odysseus, and soon, Ajax's attempted assassination was known throughout the camp. When Ajax came to his senses and realized what he had done, he was so ashamed that he went to the beach and took his own life. Initially, Agamemnon and Menelaus forbade anyone from burying Ajax, but Odysseus intervened, hoping to avoid further internal conflict. So, a new grave was constructed next to Achilles and Patroclus. This was the tomb of Ajax the Great, the hero whose abilities were second only to Achilles. Despite losing their two best commanders, the Greeks still had Odysseus, who, while not as formidable in battle as the others, was far more clever. Meanwhile, King Priam had one son left, Helenus, who had the gift of prophecy. Odysseus learned that Helenus held a divine prophecy about Troy's fate. So, one dark, moonless night, Odysseus snuck into Troy and kidnapped Helenus. According to Helenus, Troy could only fall if the Greeks completed 3 tasks. First, they had to bring Philocrates, Hercules' disciple, to fight at Troy. Second, they had to bring Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, to join the war. And third, they needed to bring the remains of Pelops, the grandfather of Agamemnon, to Troy. The first two tasks seemed easy enough, but getting Philoctetes was another matter. Philoctetes had been bitten by a snake and abandoned on the island of Lemnos. He survived all these years thanks to Hercules' bow and arrows, but convincing him to fight again was no small task. It wasn't until Hercules himself appeared to Philoctetes, telling him, "I gave you that bow to shoot people, not birds. Go fight," that Philoctetes finally agreed to join the Greeks. After arriving in Troy, Philoctetes was treated for his leg by Machaon, the son of the healer god Asclepius and grandson of Apollo. Don't ask me where Machaon was when Philoctetes was bitten by the snake 10 years ago. Once his leg was healed, Philoctetes grabbed his bow and headed back into battle. He shot Paris, the man who caused the war, dead. Well, he only wounded him at first, but because Hercules' arrows were poisoned with Hydra's venom, Paris soon died. With that, Philoctetes had taken his revenge on Achilles' behalf. Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, arrived in Troy and also killed a number of Trojan leaders. As for bringing the remains of Agamemnon's grandfather Pelops to Troy to be buried, well, I don't really know why they bothered with that. Maybe it was for the feng shui. After completing all three tasks, the Greek forces began to see a noticeable weakening in Troy's defenses, but they still couldn't bring the city down. Helenus' prophecy was looking fishy, so Odysseus snuck into the city once more. This time he met Helen and learned about the Palladium, a sacred protective statue that the Trojans had. Odysseus returned to the Greek camp, gathered Diomedes and a group of elite warriors, and set off to steal it. They snuck in, disguised as usual. It wasn't hard. Once they had the Palladium, Odysseus came up with a new plan. He had a giant wooden horse built and had the best of the Greek warriors hide inside its belly, including himself, Menelaus, Philoctetes, Diomedes, Ajax the Lesser, Neoptolemus, and others. The next morning, the Trojans were greeted with a strange sight. The Greek army had disappeared, and all that remained was a massive wooden horse on the beach, taller than Troy's walls. Thinking the war was over, the Trojans rushed out to the beach to celebrate. Not sure what to do with the horse, they caught a Greek soldier, Sinon, who had been left behind. Sinon claimed to be a relative of Palamedes, the man who had exposed Odysseus's feigned madness. Because of this, Odysseus hated him and tried to have him killed, so Sinon had deserted. He explained that the wooden horse was a gift from the Greeks, meant to appease Athena for stealing the Palladium. According to Sinon, the Greeks had to leave it behind as an offering, but they made it so large that the Trojans couldn't get it inside their walls. This was all part of Odysseus' plan. Priam didn't see it that way, though. He thought, a horse taller than the walls? Easy, we'll just break down the walls to bring it in. The Trojans, eager to celebrate their supposed victory, agreed. They started to tear down parts of the wall to get the horse inside. That night, Helen and Sinon secretly set a large fire on the high walls, signaling the Greek forces hiding on a nearby island to return. Sinon then sneaked over to the wooden horse to inform the hidden soldiers. The soldiers quickly emerged and split into two groups. One group, led by Odysseus, went to kill the guards at the breach in the wall. The other group went to set fire to the treasure houses and other buildings, creating chaos. When the main Greek army landed and moved in, the slaughter began. The elderly and children were killed on the spot, and women were taken as prisoners. Neoptolemus killed every member of King Priam's family, young and old. Menelaus charged in, determined to kill Helen to satisfy his anger. But when he saw her, he changed his mind and ordered her to be taken to a ship, preparing to return to Greece. Meanwhile, Troy was massacred, looted, and burned to the ground in a horrifying scene. Today, in world literature, the phrase Trojan horse is used to describe an internal force, a sabotaging element from within. However, a group of Trojans, led by Aeneas, the son of the goddess Aphrodite, survived the destruction. They sailed westward in search of new lands and eventually reached the plains of Latium in central Italy. There they founded a new city, which would later become Rome, the heart of the mighty Roman Empire. The Romans would eventually return to conquer Greece, a twist of fate. But that's a story for another time. If you'd like to see a series on the Roman Empire, let me know in the comments. And that marks the end of the 5th generation of heroes, the generation of the Trojan War. When we compare this generation to the previous ones, we can recognize a few key differences. The achievements of earlier generations involved slaying monsters, defeating bandits, and conquering nature. The heroes of Troy, however, were focused on killing enemies, taking weapons, and plundering treasures. In their relationships with the gods, the earlier generations often revered and respected them, even if there were occasional acts of defiance followed by punishment. But in the Trojan War, we see humans daring to challenge the gods, not just in words, but in action. They fought gods directly, injuring them and forcing them to retreat. We witness the growing assertion of humanity's role and position in relation to the divine. Paris was judged in a beauty contest among the gods, and while humans' destinies were still largely shaped by the gods, they had begun to make their own decisions to some extent. Achilles chose to join the war, fully aware of his impending death. He had his own thoughts and beliefs. The character of Hector reflects this too. He wasn't just a pawn in the gods' game, but a man with his own will. Before Troy, we had heroes who acted without much introspection. But in the Trojan War, we saw heroes who not only acted, but also thought before they did. This progression can only be understood through the development of human society. Greek society stood on the brink of civilization, and as it advanced, its mythological figures began to reflect the same progress, evolving with the culture that shaped them. After the Greeks secured their victory, their journey home was far from smooth. Menelaus wandered all the way to Egypt before he finally made it back to Greece. Diomedes and Agamemnon, upon returning, were betrayed by their wives. Diomedes moved to southern Italy to start a new life, but Agamemnon's fate was even worse. He was killed by both his wife and her lover. Then Agamemnon's son, Orestes, avenged his father by killing his mother. He also traveled to Larica and reunited with his sister Iphigenia, who had been sacrificed long ago. But of all the stories of returning home, none was more dramatic than that of Odysseus. The hero who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse spent 10 years trying to make his way back. He encountered countless disasters, lost nearly all his comrades and ships, and was the only one to return home to Ithaca. However, upon arrival, he found 108 nobles plotting to steal his wife and his throne. With the help of his son, Telemachus, Odysseus defeated them. This tale is famously chronicled by the great poet Homer in his epic, The Odyssey, which stretches over 12,000 lines. Since it's so long, I'll just summarize it here. Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, and Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, are two emblematic figures of the sixth and final generation of heroes. However, many scholars argue that this generation is somewhat of an epilogue. The Trojan War marks the end of Greek mythology, and what follows enters the realm of history. Many historical studies suggest that the war actually took place, likely around the 12th or 11th century BCE, with some estimates placing it between 1194 and 1184 BCE. But the Greek mythology series for kids isn't over yet. The Trojan War was the last battle for humanity, but mythology should end with the final battle of the gods. That battle is the Gigantomachia and the fight with Typhon, which I've saved for the very last video of the series, the one after this one.